It all started, as these things often do, with something small. Infuriatingly small, in fact. My mailbox. Not the structural integrity of it, mind you, nor its placement, nor even its perfectly functional flag. No, it was the color. A rather fetching shade of heritage blue, if I do say so myself, painstakingly chosen to complement the Victorian-esque trim on my little bungalow in what was, until recently, the placidly named Harmony Creek subdivision. I'm Arthur Jenkins, retired actuary. A man who appreciates order, precision, and the quiet enjoyment of his own property. For 30 years, I'd crunched numbers, assessed risks, and lived a life dictated by logic and spreadsheets. Retirement was supposed to be my reward. Meticulously tended rose bushes, the morning paper, and a blessed absence of officious busybodies telling me what to do. Harmony Creek, with its tree-lined streets and promises of peaceful coexistence, seemed the perfect haven. Alas, I had not accounted for the formidable and frankly terrifying president of our homeowners association, Mrs. Mildred McMillan. The first notice arrived on a Tuesday, tucked innocuously between a circular for lawn care services and a postcard from my niece who was backpacking through Patagonia. It was printed on cheap, off-white paper, the ink slightly smeared, as if produced by a printer on its last legs. A rather apt metaphor for the HOA itself, as I would later discover. Official notice of bylaw violation. It declared in an aggressive, bold typeface. The violation. Non-conforming mailbox coloration. Section 4, subsection B, paragraph 3. All street-facing appurtenances, including but not limited to mail receptacles, must adhere to the pre-approved HOA color palette. The remedy demanded was simple. Repaint to an approved neutral tone. The deadline was 2 weeks, after which fines would accrue. Fines. For a mailbox painted a blue so dignified it could have graced the gates of Buckingham Palace. I chuckled, initially. Surely this was a mistake, an overzealous intern at the HOA office, perhaps? I'd simply explain the historical appropriateness of heritage blue for a house of my architectural styling, and that would be that. Oh, Arthur, you sweet, naive summer child. My subsequent phone call to the HOA office was routed directly to Mrs. McMillan herself, a woman whose voice sounded like gravel gargling vinegar. Mr. Jenkins, she began, no pleasantries exchanged. The bylaws are quite clear. Heritage blue, as you call it, is not on the approved list. Standard beige, desert tan, or suburban gray are your options. I attempted to reason with her, explaining my research, the aesthetic harmony I was aiming for. She cut me off. Mr. Jenkins, your personal preferences are irrelevant. We have standards to maintain in Harmony Creek. If everyone chose their own garish colors, imagine the chaos. Repaint the mailbox, or face the consequences. The line went dead with a decisive click, leaving me staring at my receiver in stunned silence. Garish? Heritage blue? The woman clearly had the aesthetic sensibilities of a concrete paving slab. This wasn't about standards, this was about power. And it seemed, was her next pet project. The fine for the first week of non-compliance was a mere $25. Annoying but manageable. I paid it while simultaneously drafting a polite, well-reasoned letter of appeal, complete with photographic examples of period-appropriate mailboxes and a paint swatch of my chosen blue. I even cited the specific subsection of the bylaws, pointing out its vagueness regarding the pre-approved color palette, which, to my knowledge, had never actually been circulated to homeowners for mailboxes specifically. This, I thought, was how civilized disputes were handled. Logic, evidence, polite discourse. I was, it turned out, playing chess while Mrs. McMillan was wielding a sledgehammer. My meticulously crafted appeal was returned a week later, not with a thoughtful rebuttal, but with a single, blood-red stamp across the first page. Rejected attached was a second violation notice, this time with the fine increased to $50 per week, and then the other notices started. My lawn, apparently, was a quarter of an inch too high in one particular patch near the birdbath. The charming little wind chime my granddaughter had made me, whose gentle tinkling was barely audible from my own porch, was suddenly a noise nuisance. A barely visible crack in the driveway, which had been there when I bought the house, was now a safety hazard requiring immediate remediation, it became abundantly clear that Mrs. McMillan was not just a stickler for rules. She was a tyrant who had mistaken her little HOA fiefdom for an actual empire. And I, with my defiant blue mailbox, was the troublesome peasant she was determined to crush. My peaceful retirement was rapidly devolving into a bureaucratic siege. My neighbors, I noticed, kept their heads down. Windows would twitch as Mrs. McMillan made her daily inspection rounds. Her clipboard held like a scepter, but no one made eye contact. Fear, it seemed, was the primary currency in Harmony Creek, and Mildred McMillan was the sole beneficiary. The Heritage blue mailbox stood as a small beacon of defiance in a sea of beige conformity. But I knew, with a sinking feeling, that this was a battle I couldn't win on her terms. Not with logic, not with appeals, and certainly not by repainting my mailbox to a color that offended my very soul. No, if I was going to fight this, I needed to change the terms of engagement entirely. The thought was nascent, a tiny spark of indignation, but it was there. If Mrs. McMillan wanted to play hardball, she was about to find out that this old actuary still had a few calculations left in him. The game, as they say, was afoot, though I doubt even I could have predicted the sheer, technicolor madness that was about to unfold. The initial annoyance had now curdled into a steely resolve. Mrs. McMillan had picked a fight with the wrong retiree. She thought this was about a mailbox. Oh, how gloriously wrong she was. The fines kept coming. Each envelope a little paper insult delivered by a mailman who was starting to look at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. I paid them, documenting each one meticulously. My spreadsheet, once reserved for tracking dividend yields and amortization schedules, now had a new tab, HOA tyranny, columns detailed dates, violation codes, amounts paid, and notes on the increasingly absurd nature of the infractions. This wasn't just about Mrs. McMillan's power trip anymore. I started to suspect there was something more to it. Why such an insistence on standard beige for mailboxes? Why the aggressive fining? Actuaries are trained to see patterns, to look beyond the surface, and the pattern here stank of something rotten. So I began to dig. Not literally, of course. My roses were too precious for that. But metaphorically. I requested copies of the HOA's financial statements, meeting minutes, contracts, my rights as a homeowner. Initially, I was met with resistance. Those documents are for board members only. Came the curt reply from the HOA secretary, a nervous, bird-like woman named Doris, who always seemed to be wringing her hands. But I persisted, quoting the relevant state statutes governing HOAs, and eventually, a grudgingly compiled stack of papers landed on my doorstep. It was a mess. Vague expense reports, invoices from the same few contractors for wildly inflated prices, and meeting minutes so heavily redacted they looked like classified government documents. One name kept appearing, McMillan Approved Services, a company that handled everything from lawn care to minor repairs to, wouldn't you know it, mailbox painting and replacement. And guess what color they exclusively offered for mailboxes? Standard. Bloody. Beige. The connection was almost laughably obvious. Mildred McMillan wasn't just a control freak. She was lining her pockets, or at least those of her cronies. I decided to take a walk, not for exercise but for reconnaissance. I strolled down my street, Oleander Lane, then up and down the adjacent Primrose Path and Wisteria Way. I paid close attention to the mailboxes. Beige, beige, a slightly different beige, probably a DIY job that hadn't yet incurred Mildred's wrath. Beige. It was a symphony of soul-crushing neutrality. But more than that, I observed the houses. Some were meticulously kept, others showed signs of benign neglect. For sale signs dotted a surprising number of lawns. Harmony Creek, it seemed, wasn't quite as harmonious as its name suggested. I started to chat casually with a few of the residents I encountered. Old Mr. Henderson, tending his prize-winning dahlias, grumbled under his breath about that McMillan woman and a ridiculous fine he'd received for his garden gnome being too whimsical a young couple. The Parkers, who were packing up a moving van, told me they were leaving specifically because of the HOA. It's like living in a beige prison, Mrs. Parker said, her voice tight with frustration. We got fined because our welcome mat said, howdy, instead of just welcome apparently, howdy. is too informal for Harmony Creek standards. The stories poured out. A litany of petty tyrannies, exorbitant fines for minor issues, and a general atmosphere of oppressive conformity. Many were too intimidated to speak up publicly, fearing retribution. Others had simply given up and were either moving out or resigning themselves to the beige blight. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was a community held hostage. The problem wasn't a rogue bylaw. It was a rogue HOA president, and the system, as it was, protected her. She controlled the board, handpicked her allies, and wielded the bylaws like a weapon. Changing the rules from within seemed impossible for a single homeowner with a non-compliant blue mailbox. The scale of the problem felt overwhelming. How do you fight an entrenched system run by someone who clearly has no shame and all the power? I sat on my porch swing that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues no HOA could ever regulate, and an idea, truly audacious and utterly ridiculous, began to flicker at the edges of my mind. It was the kind of idea that only a retired actuary with too much time on his hands and a significant nest egg could conceive. It was wildly impractical, colossally expensive, and probably certifiably insane. And yet, the more I thought about it, the more it made a crazy kind of sense. If you can't beat them, I mused, perhaps you buy them. Not bribe them, no. Buy the system, the houses, the votes. The kernel of the idea, once planted, began to sprout with alarming speed. I spent the next few days not in my garden, but hunched over my computer, my old actuarial skills kicking back in. I researched property values in Harmony Creek, current listings, average sale times, mortgage rates. I delved into my own financial portfolio, stocks, bonds, mutual funds accumulated over decades of prudent saving and investing. I'd always been conservative, risk-averse. This was the opposite of conservative. This was a gamble of epic proportions. But the image of Mrs. McMillan's smug face, the memory of her dismissive tone, the thought of all those beige mailboxes stretching into infinity, it fueled a recklessness I hadn't known I possessed. The plan was simple in its audacity. I would start buying houses in Harmony Creek, specifically on my street, Oleander Lane. One by one, each house came with HOA voting rights. Enough houses, enough votes, and Mrs. McMillan's reign of beige terror could be brought to a rather colorful end. It was the ultimate hostile takeover, suburban style. My first call was to Sarah Chin. Sarah was a young, incredibly sharp realtor who had helped me find my bungalow a few years back. I remembered being impressed by her tenacity and her no-nonsense attitude. When I laid out my unconventional investment strategy, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I braced myself for her to laugh, or to gently suggest I seek psychiatric counseling. Instead, she finally said, "Mr. Jenkins, are you absolutely serious?" "As serious as a heart attack, Sarah," I replied. "Or perhaps, as serious as a heritage blue mailbox in a sea of beige." Another pause, shorter this time. Then, a low whistle. "Well, Arthur," she said, a distinct note of amusement and intrigue in her voice. "This is certainly a new one for me, but I like a challenge. Let's talk specifics. And Mr. Jenkins? We're going to need to be very, very discreet." Discreet was my middle name. Or it would be for this operation. We decided to set up a series of anonymous LLCs, Oleander Holdings Group, Primrose Property Ventures, that sort of thing. Sarah would act as the purchasing agent, shielding my identity. Our first target was a somewhat run-down rental property 2 doors down from me. The owner lived out of state and was, according to Sarah's research, eager to sell. We made a swift, all-cash offer slightly above asking price to ensure a quick, uncomplicated sale. Within 3 weeks, Oleander Holdings Group LLC was the proud, if anonymous, owner of its first property on Oleander Lane. Mrs. McMillan, I imagined, was blissfully unaware, probably busy drafting a new violation notice for someone whose wind chimes were playing a tune in an unapproved key. One house down. Many, many more to go. The sheer scale of what I was attempting was beginning to dawn on me, but so was a thrilling sense of purpose. This wasn't just about my mailbox anymore. This was about liberation. Liberation from beige. Liberation from bullies. and I, Arthur Jenkins, retired actuary, was about to become the most unlikely revolutionary Harmony Creek had ever seen. The acquisition phase began in earnest, a silent, strategic campaign waged through wire transfers and notarized documents. Sarah Chun proved to be an absolute godsend, a whirlwind of efficiency and discretion. She had an uncanny ability to sniff out potential sellers before their properties even hit the market, disgruntled homeowners eager to escape Macmillan's clutches, investors looking to offload rental units, families relocating for work. We moved quickly, often making all-cash offers to expedite closings and minimize scrutiny. Each transaction was conducted through a different newly formed LLC, names carefully chosen to be innocuous: Willow Creek Investments, Acorn Residential, Buttonwood Properties. It was a complex web of ownership designed to obscure the fact that a single individual was behind the buying spree. I felt a bit like a covert operative, my days filled with reviewing property disclosures, signing paperwork under various corporate titles: president of Acorn, managing member of Buttonwood. It had a certain ring to it, and transferring substantial sums of money. My accountant, a perpetually worried man named Gerald, nearly had kittens when I explained my diversification strategy. "Arthur," he'd stammered, "you're concentrating an awful lot of capital into one hyper-local, somewhat eccentric real estate venture." I'd simply smiled and told him to trust my calculations. The risk, I knew, was enormous, but the potential reward, a neighborhood free from petty tyranny, and the look on Mildred Macmillan's face when she realized what had happened was, in my estimation, priceless. Meanwhile, life on Oleander Lane continued under Macmillan's watchful eye. She remained blissfully ignorant of the changing ownership landscape. Houses sold, new, albeit usually vacant, for now. LLCs took possession, but as far as she was concerned, it was just the normal churn of the property market. Her focus remained laser-sharp on the minutiae of her reign. The precise shade of beige on Mr. Henderson's fence, a shade too creamy, apparently. The unauthorized planting of petunias, pansies were the approved annual, in Mrs. Albright's window box, and of course my still defiantly heritage blue mailbox, which was now accruing fines at an alarming rate. I continued to pay them, each check written with a grim sense of satisfaction, knowing it was fuel for her eventual downfall. The process was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. With each successful closing, my voting power within the HOA increased. I started attending the monthly HOA meetings again, not to argue about my mailbox, but simply to observe, to listen, to count the potential allies and enemies. Mrs. Macmillan still presided with her iron gavel, flanked by her two loyal board cronies, Agnes Periwinkle and Stanislav Grumbles, both of whom seemed to derive a grim satisfaction from seconding her every draconian motion. They barely registered my presence, other than perhaps a disdainful sniff from Macmillan as I took my seat in the back row. Little did they know, the quiet retiree in the corner was slowly, methodically buying their kingdom out from under them. Sarah and I developed a rhythm. She'd identify a target, we'd strategize the offer, and then she'd work her magic. Some sales were easier than others. The Parker house, where the couple had been fined for their "howdy, Matt," practically fell into our laps. They were so desperate to leave, they accepted our first offer without negotiation. Another homeowner, a widower named Mr. Abernathy, was being harassed by Macmillan over the slightly peeling paint on his garden shed. He was old, tired, and just wanted peace. He sold to Primrose Property Ventures with a sigh of relief, even shaking my hand. I met him briefly at the closing, posing as a representative of the LLC, and wishing me luck with that woman. Each story of petty harassment steeled my resolve. This wasn't just about curb appeal, it was about human dignity. And Macmillan was trampling all over it. Of course, not every house on Oleander Lane was immediately available. Some residents were perfectly happy, or at least resigned to their beige fate. Others were long-term homeowners with no intention of moving. My goal wasn't necessarily to own every single house, but to acquire enough to have a controlling interest in the HOA votes for our section, and ideally enough to make a very loud, very colorful statement. By the end of the 6th month of my clandestine campaign, Arthur Jenkins Incognito Holdings, as I privately called my collection of LLCs, owned 5 houses on Oleander Lane, including my own. That gave me 5 votes. Enough to be a nuisance, perhaps, but not enough for a revolution. Yet, the real challenge lay ahead. 2 more properties on my side of the street were needed for a clear majority on the lane, and they weren't currently for sale. This would require patience and perhaps a bit more active persuasion. But for now, the stealth phase was largely complete. The seeds of chaos had been sown, quietly and efficiently. Soon it would be time to let them bloom. The time for subtle acquisitions was drawing to a close. The moment for a more overt form of gardening, shall we say, was approaching. I now owned 5 properties on Oleander Lane, not counting my own. It was a significant beachhead, but I craved a more decisive visual impact before making any moves on the HOA board itself. One of my newly acquired properties, number 17 Oleander, was a rental that had sat vacant for a few weeks while I arranged for some minor repairs. Its mailbox, naturally, was a dull, HOA-approved beige, peeling slightly at the edges. An idea, mischievous and delightful, sparked. Why wait to challenge the bylaws formally when I could start a small, colorful skirmish right now? Under the cloak of one of my LLCs, Canary Properties LLC, a name I chose with a chuckle, I hired a painter. Not for the house, not yet. Just for the mailbox. I instructed him to paint it a vibrant, unapologetic shade of sunflower yellow. It was, I felt, a cheerful act of defiance. The effect was immediate and, from my perspective across the street, glorious. Amidst the sea of beige, number 17's mailbox shone like a miniature sun. It took Mrs. Macmillan less than 24 hours. A violation notice, almost identical to the ones I'd been receiving, was slapped onto the door of number 17. Addressed to current resident or property owner, it cited the same vague bylaw and demanded an immediate return to approved neutral tones this time, however. The response wouldn't be silence or a meekly paid fine. As the managing member of Canary Properties LLC, I drafted a polite but firm letter. Dear Harmony Creek Homeowners Association, it began, Canary Properties LLC is in receipt of your notice regarding the mailbox at 17 Oleander Lane. We kindly request a copy of the pre-approved HOA color palette, referenced in Bylaw Section 4, Subsection B, Paragraph 3, specifically as it pertains to mail receptacles. Despite diligent review of HOA documentation provided at closing, we have been unable to locate such a list. Until this documentation is provided, we consider the matter under review and reserve our right to maintain the current aesthetic. I CC'd the HOA's legal counsel, a sleepy-eyed fellow named Bartholomew Trumbull, whose office I suspected was largely funded by Macmillan's incessant fining. A week later, another of my properties, number 21 Oleander, managed by Azure Abodes Limited, had its mailbox transformed. This time, it was a brilliant cerulean blue, a shade even more vibrant than my own heritage blue. Another violation notice. Another carefully worded legal letter from Azure Abodes Limited, requesting the elusive color palette. Mrs. Macmillan must have been spitting tacks. Her tidy little world of beige conformity was being invaded by rogue splashes of color, and the anonymous corporate owners were proving to be surprisingly litigious. I could almost hear her complaining to Agnes Periwinkle over lukewarm tea and stale biscuits about these out-of-state investment companies, with no respect for Harmony Creek traditions. Whispers started to ripple through the neighborhood. People noticed the yellow mailbox, then the cerulean one. They weren't my mailbox, which was still stubbornly heritage blue and still racking up fines, but they were close. Too close for coincidence. I saw Mr. Henderson pause a little longer by the yellow mailbox on his morning walk, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. Mrs. Parker, before she finally moved out, gave me a knowing wink as she drove past the cerulean mailbox. The atmosphere was subtly shifting. Fear was still present, but now it was mingled with a hesitant curiosity, perhaps even a tiny spark of hope. Someone or something was pushing back. Macmillan, for her part, doubled down. She began patrolling Oleander Lane with increased frequency, her expression thunderous. I saw her taking photographs of the offending mailboxes, her lips moving as if she were dictating furious missives to her imaginary secretary. The HOA board meetings became even more tense. She railed against irresponsible property owners and anarchic color choices. conveniently forgetting that her own bylaws were as clear as mud on the actual approved colors. Bartholomew Trumbull, the HOA lawyer, started looking increasingly uncomfortable during these tirades, occasionally dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. He knew, I suspected, that the LLCs had a point. A vague bylaw is an unenforceable bylaw. The pressure was building on Macmillan. The administrative burden of dealing with multiple defiant LLCs, each demanding documentation and threatening legal challenges, was clearly taking its toll. Doris, the HOA's secretary, looked more harried than usual, her desk piled high with correspondence from Canary Properties, Azure Abodes, and soon, Emerald Estates plc. After number 12 Oleander's mailbox turned a rather fetching shade of Kelly green. My little mailbox rebellion was escalating, one vibrant hue at a time. And the best part? She still had no idea it was all me. Arthur Jenkins, the quiet retiree with the problematic blue mailbox, was still just a minor irritant in her grand scheme of things. Or so she thought. The true masterpiece, the full rainbow, was yet to come. I was just warming up. The mailbox skirmishes were amusing, a delightful appetizer. But I knew the main course needed to be something far more substantial. Owning a handful of houses and painting their mailboxes bright colors was one thing. Fundamentally shifting the power dynamic in Harmony Creek required a bolder stroke. My goal had always been to secure a majority of properties on Oleander Lane, or at least my side of it. Sarah Chun had been working diligently, and a breakthrough came when old Mrs. Gable, who lived 3 doors down, decided to move into an assisted living facility. Her children, eager to sell the house quickly, were receptive to a fair cash offer from yet another of my anonymous entities, Garnet Homes LLC, that brought my total to 6 houses on Oleander Lane, plus my own. 7 out of the 12 houses on our side of the street. Clear majority. It was time. Time to stop nibbling at the edges and unleash the full spectrum of my vision. I contacted several reputable painting companies, requesting quotes for exterior house painting. Not for one house, but for 6. Simultaneously. The logistics were complex, requiring careful coordination to ensure all crews could work over the same extended weekend. I wanted a synchronized transformation, a sudden, overwhelming burst of color that would leave no doubt about the seriousness of my intent. Sarah, bless her organizational heart, helped manage the scheduling, dealing with the contractors as the representative of the various LLCs. I chose the colors myself, meticulously planning a progression down the street. Number 12, already sporting its emerald green mailbox, would become a deep forest green. Number 17, with its sunflower yellow mailbox, would be painted a cheerful, buttery yellow. Number 21, a calming sky blue. Mrs. Gable's former house, number 15, a vibrant tangerine orange. The rental next to me, number 9, a passionate magenta. And the one on the corner, number 7, a regal amethyst purple. My own house, number 11, would remain, for the time being, in its original state, its heritage blue mailbox a subtle nod to the genesis of this whole affair. It would stand as the calm center of the impending chromatic storm. The chosen weekend arrived, a bright, sunny Saturday in late spring. At precisely 8 a.m., multiple vans and trucks from different painting companies converged on Oleander Lane. Ladders were unfurled, tarps laid down, paint cans opened. The quiet suburban morning was shattered by the sounds of preparation, the clatter of equipment, and the low hum of generators. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the unusual level of activity. First, curiosity. Then, as the first vibrant strokes of color began to appear on the siding of number 12, confusion. By mid-morning, as hues of yellow, blue, and orange started to transform the beige landscape, the confusion morphed into outright astonishment. I watched from my porch, sipping my morning tea, a quiet smile on my face. Mrs. Macmillan, predictably, was one of the first official responders. Her beige sensible sedan screeched to a halt at the end of the lane. She emerged, clipboard already in hand, her face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into incandescent rage. She marched from house to house, demanding to know what was going on, who had authorized this. This Technicolor travesty. The crew foreman, under strict instructions from Sarah, simply shrugged, handed her a business card for the respective LLC that owned the property, and continued their work. Her sputtering protests about unapproved color schemes and flagrant bylaw violations were lost amidst the sounds of scraping, sanding, and the rhythmic hiss of paint sprayers. By Sunday evening, Oleander Lane was unrecognizable. 6 houses, previously muted and unremarkable, now blazed in a glorious, defiant rainbow. Green, yellow, blue, orange, magenta, purple. Each distinct, each vibrant, each a testament to the end of beige tyranny. My own house, still in its more subdued colors, looked almost quaint nestled amongst its flamboyant neighbors. The effect was breathtaking, hilarious, and utterly transformative. Residents from other streets in Harmony Creek began to drive by slowly, their windows down, faces pressed against the glass, marveling at the spectacle. Some looked horrified, others delighted. Children pointed and giggled. The Rainbow Row, as it was quickly dubbed, was born. And then it was time for my reveal. As Mrs. McMillan stood in the middle of the street, practically vibrating with fury, surrounded by a small crowd of bewildered and amused onlookers, I calmly walked down my porch steps and approached her. "Good evening, Mildred," I said, my voice even. She whirled around, her eyes narrowing. "Jenkins, do you see this vandalism? I'll have every one of these clowns fined into oblivion. This is an outrage." "Actually, Mildred," I replied, allowing myself a small, satisfied smile, "it's not vandalism, it's merely redecoration. And as for the fines, well, you'll be sending them to the property owners, of course." "I most certainly will," she shrieked. "And who are these irresponsible, absentee landlords?" "Well," I said, gesturing expansively at the vibrant streetscape, "that would be me." The silence that followed was profound. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Mrs. McMillan's jaw, which had been working furiously, simply hung open. Her face went through a fascinating series of color changes itself, from puce to scarlet, before settling on a rather alarming shade of pale gray. "You?" she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "You own all of these?" "6 of them, to be precise," I confirmed. "Plus my own, of course. That makes 7. A rather comfortable majority on this particular stretch of Oleander Lane, wouldn't you say?" The crowd murmured. Mr. Henderson let out a distinct chuckle. Sarah Chun, who had arrived quietly and was now standing beside me, gave me a subtle thumbs up. Mildred McMillan looked as though she might spontaneously combust. The sheer, glorious audacity of it all was finally sinking in. She had tried to find me for 1 blue mailbox. In response, I had bought her street and painted it a rainbow. Checkmate, Mildred. Checkmate. The immediate aftermath of the great rainbow painting of Oleander Lane was, to put it mildly, chaotic. Mrs. McMillan, after her initial stunned silence, launched into a tirade that would have made a drill sergeant blush. She threatened lawsuits, emergency HOA meetings, injunctions, public shaming, the works. I listened patiently, a calm smile fixed on my face, which only seemed to incense her further. "You can't just do this, Jenkins," she finally sputtered, her voice cracking. "It's against the rules." "Ah, but Mildred," I countered gently. "Which rules, specifically?" "The ones that vaguely mention an approved color palette that has never been clearly defined or circulated for house exteriors. I believe my LLCs have been asking for that list for some time now regarding the mailboxes, to no avail. Or are there new, secret rules for entire houses that only you are privy to?" Bartholomew Trumbull, the HOA lawyer, who had been summoned by a frantic phone call from McMillan, arrived looking pale and harried. He surveyed the scene, the 6 vibrantly painted houses, the stunned crowd, the apoplectic HOA president, and me, the picture of serene defiance, and I could almost see the billable hours ticking up in his eyes, followed swiftly by the dawning horror of the legal quagmire he was about to be dragged into. "Mrs. McMillan," he began, clearing his throat nervously, "perhaps we should discuss this in a more private setting "There's nothing to discuss," she shrieked. "He's ruined Harmony Creek. It looks like a clown exploded." A little girl in the crowd giggled and said, "I like clowns, Mommy," which didn't improve Macmillan's mood. The next HOA meeting was an event for the ages, usually attended by a handful of board residents and Macmillan's loyal cronies. This time the community hall was packed. Word of Rainbow Row had spread like wildfire, not just through Harmony Creek, but to local news outlets. A cameraman from a local TV station was even present, much to Macmillan's visible displeasure. I arrived with Sarah Chun by my side, and a rather dapper, sharp-eyed lawyer named Mr. Alistair Finch, whom Sarah had recommended. I wasn't taking any chances. I also carried a rather thick sheaf of papers, the proxies for the 6 properties I owned through my LLCs. When Mrs. Macmillan called the meeting to order, her voice trembling with suppressed rage, the tension in the room was palpable. She immediately launched into a diatribe about the wanton destruction of neighborhood character and the flagrant disregard for established community standards, all directed squarely at me. When she finally paused for breath, I calmly stood up. "Mrs. Macmillan," I began, my voice amplified slightly by the microphone Mr. Finch had thoughtfully provided. "Before we proceed with your assessment of my aesthetic choices, I believe there are some procedural matters to address. As the designated representative for Oleander Holdings Group LLC, Canary Properties LLC, Azure Abodes Limited, Emerald Estates PLC, Garnet Homes LLC, and Buttonwood Properties LLC, I hold 6 votes in addition to my personal vote for my residence at 11 Oleander Lane. I fanned out the proxy forms. A gasp went through the room. Macmillan's face, if possible, became even tighter. Furthermore, I continued, I'd like to formally submit a motion to review and amend the existing bylaws pertaining to architectural and aesthetic standards, specifically to introduce clarity, transparency, and a fair appeals process. The current vagueness, as we've seen, leads to arbitrary enforcement and, frankly, unnecessary conflict. Mr. Finch then chimed in, his voice smooth and authoritative, outlining the legal basis for challenging ambiguously worded covenants and the potential for the HOA to face significant legal costs if it pursued punitive action against properties whose owners were, in fact, simply requesting clearly defined guidelines. The mood in the room began to shift. Other residents, emboldened by my actions and the presence of legal counsel challenging Macmillan, started to speak up. Old Mr. Henderson recounted his whimsical gnome fine. The Parkers, though they'd moved, had sent a letter, read aloud by a sympathetic neighbor, detailing their Howdy Matt ordeal. Story after story of petty fines, opaque rules, and Macmillan's autocratic behavior tumbled out. Her 2 board cronies, Agnes Periwinkle and Stanislav Grumbles, began to look distinctly uncomfortable, avoiding her gaze. The TV camera whirred, capturing every moment. Mrs. Macmillan's carefully constructed empire of beige was crumbling before her very eyes, one colorful testimony at a time. The community, long cowed into submission, was finally finding its voice, and it was a voice that resonated with the vibrant hues of Oleander Lane. The HOA meeting turned into a referendum on Mildred Macmillan's leadership. My motion to review the bylaws passed overwhelmingly, thanks to my 7 votes and a surprising number of other residents who, tasting freedom, joined the rebellion. Macmillan tried to filibuster, to object, to declare motions out of order, but her power was broken. Mr. Finch calmly and methodically dismantled her procedural objections, citing chapter and verse of the HOA's own governing documents she had clearly weaponized but perhaps never fully understood from a legal standpoint. The high point of the evening, for me at least, was when I proposed a second motion. A vote of no confidence in the current HOA president, Mrs. Mildred Macmillan, and a call for new board elections. The stunned silence that followed was quickly broken by a smattering of applause, which then grew into a wave of support. Agnes Periwinkle suddenly found her voice, not to defend Macmillan, but to announce she was resigning from the board, effective immediately, citing health reasons. Stanislav Grumbles, looking like he'd swallowed a lemon, mumbled something about needing to spend more time with his stamp collection and followed suit. Macmillan was left isolated, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. The vote of no confidence passed. Mildred Macmillan, the Queen of Beige, was dethroned. The subsequent special election saw a new slate of board members elected, individuals who promised transparency, fairness, and a more community-focused approach. I myself was nominated, but I politely declined. My work, I felt, was done in that particular arena. I preferred to be a catalyst, not a committee chairman. However, I did ensure that individuals like Mr. Henderson, with his quiet wisdom and love for whimsical gnomes, were encouraged to step up. The new board's first order of business was a thorough review of the HOA's finances. And oh, what a review that was! It turned out that Macmillan Approved Services, the contractor for all things beige and bland, was co-owned by Mildred's nephew, and the rates charged to the HOA were consistently 30 to 40% above market value. The slush fund, I'd suspected, wasn't just for petty cash. It was a systematic skimming operation. The new board, armed with this information, turned the matter over to the authorities. Mildred Macmillan, who had terrorized Harmony Creek over mailbox colors and lawn heights, found herself facing potential legal consequences far more serious than any HOA fine. As for Oleander Lane, it became something of a local legend. Rainbow Row, as the newspapers dubbed it, started attracting visitors. People would drive by slowly, taking pictures. Artists set up easels on the sidewalk. Some of the more conservative residents in other parts of Harmony Creek grumbled, but many more were delighted by the splash of color and the story of defiance it represented. Property values, contrary to Macmillan's dire predictions of plummeting worth, actually saw a slight uptick. Uniqueness, it turned out, had its own market appeal. I had to decide what to do with my newly acquired portfolio of colorful houses. Selling them all off immediately felt wrong. I hadn't gone through all this trouble just to cash out. Instead, I decided to become a landlord, a fair and reasonable one, I hoped. I worked with Sarah Chun to find good tenants for the houses, people who appreciated the vibrancy and the spirit of the street. Young families, artists, professionals who were tired of cookie-cutter living. Oleander Lane began to feel like a real community, diverse and full of life. The oppressive pall of conformity had lifted. The new HOA board, true to its word, rewrote many of the more ludicrous bylaws. The infamous approved color palette was expanded significantly, encouraging tasteful individuality rather than enforced monotony. Welcome mats of all cheerful greetings were permitted. Whimsical garden gnomes were practically encouraged. Harmony Creek began to live up to its name, not through rigid control, but through a newfound sense of mutual respect and a celebration of individuality. And my own mailbox, the heritage blue one that started it all? It remained heritage blue. For a long time, it was the only mailbox on the street that wasn't part of the coordinated rainbow. It stood as a quiet monument to the spark that ignited the fire. The fines, of course, had stopped. In fact, the new HOA board issued me a formal apology and a full refund for every penny I'd paid under Macmillan's regime, a gesture I deeply appreciated. The whole ordeal had been expensive, stressful, and utterly consuming. But standing on my porch, looking out at the cheerful, vibrant homes of Rainbow Row, watching children play on sidewalks no longer patrolled by a petty tyrant, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. It was more than just winning a fight. It was about reclaiming a space, fostering a community, and proving that sometimes the most audacious, unexpected, and colorful solutions are the best ones. Mildred Macmillan had wanted a war over beige. I gave her a rainbow revolution, and it was beautiful. Life on Rainbow Row settled into a new, vibrant rhythm. The initial flurry of media attention faded, but the street retained its newfound fame. It became a bit of a local landmark, a symbol of standing up to petty bureaucracy. Tourists still occasionally drove by, but mostly it was just us, the residents, enjoying our colorful corner of the world. I found I rather enjoyed being a landlord, especially to tenants who appreciated the unique character of their homes. We had block parties, something unheard of in the Macmillan era. The houses, once silent investment vehicles, now buzzed with life. Children's laughter replaced the hushed whispers of disgruntled homeowners. My garden flourished, no longer under the threat of violation notices for an errant dandelion. I even added a few more wind chimes, their melodies now a welcome sound in the neighborhood. The new HOA board, under the sensible leadership of people like Mr. Henderson, who turned out to be a surprisingly adept chairman, his gunhome-related trauma having given him a deep appreciation for reasonable governance, focused on genuine community improvements. Upgrading the playground equipment in the local park, organizing neighborhood watch programs, and even hosting a yearly Harmony Creek Arts Fair, with Rainbow Row as its centerpiece. Mildred McMillan faded into obscurity. The investigation into her financial dealings with McMillan-approved services rumbled on, and last I heard, she'd moved out of state, her reputation in Harmony Creek thoroughly and deservedly tarnished. Her reign of beige was well and truly over. Sometimes, I'd sit on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the world go by, and reflect on the sheer improbability of it all. From a single, defiant blue mailbox to an entire street painted in every color imaginable. It was a testament to the fact that one person, pushed too far, can indeed make a difference, albeit in a rather unconventional and financially adventurous way. I wouldn't necessarily recommend buying up your entire neighborhood as a standard conflict resolution strategy. But in my specific case, it had been surprisingly effective. One sunny afternoon, about a year after the Great Rainbow painting, I found myself standing in front of my own mailbox, the heritage blue one. It looked distinguished, certainly, but now, amidst the vibrant symphony of colors on Oleander Lane, it also looked a little solitary, like the conductor of an orchestra who hadn't quite joined the final, exuberant chorus. I thought about all the options. I could paint it a dazzling gold, a trophy for my victory, or perhaps a pure, defiant white, a clean slate. But neither felt quite right. Then, an idea struck me, one that brought a smile to my face. I went to the hardware store not for beige, never again for beige, but for a selection of small, artist-quality paint pots. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows down Rainbow Row, I sat on a small stool in front of my mailbox. Carefully, meticulously, I began to paint. Not a solid color, but a design. I painted tiny, individual bricks, each one a different color of the rainbow, mirroring the houses on my street. A miniature representation of Oleander Lane, right there on my mailbox. Heritage blue still peeked through as the grout between the tiny, colorful bricks, a nod to where it all began. It was intricate work, requiring patience and a steady hand, but it felt right. It was my final, personal touch, a quiet celebration of the community we had become. It wasn't loud or defiant anymore, but harmonious, a tiny mosaic of the larger, vibrant picture. Arthur Jenkins, retired actuary, accidental revolutionary, and now a contented resident of the most colorful street in town. And as I looked at my newly painted mailbox, a microcosm of Rainbow Row itself, I knew one thing for sure. Life is far too short for beige. Sometimes you just have to grab all the colors you can find and paint your own damn masterpiece, even if it starts with something as simple or as infuriating as the color of a mailbox.